Hello and welcome to the Bad Things channel. Today we're going to talk about the 80s and the Satanic Panic. Many people don't know how it started and fewer people really understand how it ended. I'm going to set that record straight now. Basically in the beginning you had, and this was before I got into the occult obviously, the Manson thing. It did create a lot of suspicion with hippies. The Tate murders were horrible. And a lot of people just were completely frightened by Manson, and they associated him with Satanism. And this is a misconception. Manson was involved with the group, but they were called the Process, and they weren't necessarily Satanists. They were involved with kind of an odd form of Christianity and Satanism mixed. It seems kind of odd, but if you read some of their literature, it gets even weirder. They're a very different group. I've never actually met someone from one of these groups, but I have read a lot of their literature, and it's strange. I can't say anything good or bad about it. It's just different. But anyway, there was this odd mistrust. The counterculture was suddenly dangerous in the 70s, and by the 80s, people were getting a little weirded out by things. The world was changing. There was a lot of immigration going on. There was Santeria was sort of emerging. And people were getting afraid. And it was because of Dungeons and Dragons, there was a lot of interest in the occult that had occurred. And a lot of this had to do with young people. And this scared the hell out of the Christians. And they thought that the Satanists were obviously coming after the youth. This wasn't going on. As a matter of fact, most left-hand path groups, including Satanism, don't even want to even mess with anybody who's not at least 18 years old. Some groups put the bar at 21. They're very serious about this. This isn't like the Catholics who pretty much take you as soon as you come out of the vagina, or the Baptists that'll indoctrinate you when you're 3. No, none of us would even mess with anybody who couldn't vote, basically. It was that simple. But the weird part is this recovered memory thing. Now, there was an odd little marriage between the psychological community and the religious right. You wouldn't think this, but they were both panicking. The religious right was worried about the interest in the occult, for obvious reasons. The psychological community was under stress because at the time there was sort of a tension with the insurance companies. Hospital stays back then could be up to 6 months long, if not more. Nowadays, they're limited to about a week. So you can see there was a lot of money they were kind of gobbling up, and this really annoyed them. As a matter of fact, when they finally did enforce the rules about the length of stay in mental hospitals, many of them had to close down. Had a friend that even worked in one that closed down, and he ended up leaving the state. It was an odd time. And then you had journalists like Geraldo who were sensationalizing all this. And I love it when he had Michael Aquino on. That interview, or not really an interview, it was more of a discussion. And they kept saying, oh, there's all these bodies, and they've killed thousands of people. And Aquino just said, where are the bodies? Just show me one. They couldn't produce one. The thing about conspiracies, especially if you're saying there's a global conspiracy, is sooner or later some tangible evidence or somebody who can give some realistic identifiable details shows up, and that never happened with the Satanic Panic. Sure, there are Satanists, yeah, they don't control the government, and they don't murder people. I guess the odd satanic killer is out there, but you also have a lot of Christian killers. Matter of fact, I remember one in particular, I called him the Angel, and he would hang around railroads, and he would kill people basically because he suspected they were Satanists. So the Satanic Panic was a very dangerous time, and it was most dangerous for Satanists because we were all pretty much knew that sooner or later it was either the authorities or some vigilante or some psycho was going to pretty much end our lives or our careers or our marriages or whatever. It was a very scary time. And then you had idiots like Geraldo who were just sensationalizing everything and trying to play up the whole drama. And it got odd. It got very dangerous. As a matter of fact, there's 2 organizations that I had to mess with that were a real pain in my side. The first one was the Cult Awareness Network. Now, they have recently been neutralized thanks to the Church of Scientology. I'm not really big on Scientology, but I do have to give them kudos for this one. They handled it through litigiousness, which, though it may not be the favorite method of everybody, it at least isn't violent, and it's legal. And they pretty much overran the organization. Now they pretty much run it. Or at least they neutralized it. I don't know really what happened with it, because they haven't messed with anybody since then. But back then, they were going to people's jobs, getting people saying, you have a Satanist who works for you. And they said, hey, murder people, or anything horrible they could say. And if they couldn't get your job, they would go after your marriage or your children. They couldn't get you there. They would try to undermine your group unity. As a matter of fact, some of them would even go as far as to infiltrate groups and send in infiltrators that they knew would break up the group. And sometimes this was successful. Sometimes they worked by being, say they had favors that the authorities would do for them. Now, that was the secular Satanic Panic group that I had to deal with. There is another group. I'm not going to name them because they still exist, or they haven't really been neutralized. And they were kind of embarrassed recently because of some pray the gay away stuff, which, I don't know, 6 of one, half dozen of the other. It seems like they're basically maniacally needing to control people, and the Satanic Panic was an opportunity to assert that control over people in very unethical ways. And that occurred, and usually when people deal with Satanists and left-hand pathers, they throw their ethics out the window. They don't think the rules apply anymore because this person is evil. Now, it's laughable because I've seen them do this to atheists too. Now, fortunately for atheists, and LaVeans too, their numbers are growing exponentially. So I don't really think they're going to be affected by a second panic. But as the Satanic Panic grew on and they began to get more and more embarrassed, they began to become more desperate, like a wounded animal. And the attacks became sloppy, but much more, I guess the only word I can use is lethal. They weren't like trying to kill us, but they were trying to destroy our jobs, our credibility. Anything the left-hand pather had, they wanted to take away. And I could say this was just a left-hand path problem, but it actually stretched its fingers out of the other occult community, specifically the neo-pagan community. Many neo-pagans, by the time the 80s rolled around, had tried to pull up this good guy persona, which it's kind of silly. But yeah, they tried to say, well, we're the white witches, or we're the good witches, or so forth. And, whether it's true or not is immaterial. They were our friends in the 70s and early 80s, and by the time the late 80s ran around, many of them were throwing us under the bus. Now, I don't hold any resentment to them because I think a thing needs to survive any way it can, and it needs to protect itself. And I do want to see a world where there's neo-pagans in it, and especially Wiccans. I value them. That being said, it was kind of a pain because we didn't really have anyone we could trust at the time. And I hope if it happens again, this doesn't happen. But it was a bad problem in so much as certain left-hand pathers were actually being named at circles and so forth. It was crazy. And it was a lot of drama, and it was very unnecessary. And people lost their careers and livelihoods. On both sides, and it was completely unnecessary. If there was such a thing as recovered memory, well, let me go into recovered memory before I go that. Basically, what you would have is someone would say, let's say they're depressed, or they have manic depression, or maybe even PTSD, a legitimate case of PTSD. They go into a psychiatrist or a therapist, and at the time, some of them were kind of bouncing around this idea of hypnotherapy. They would supposedly put someone under hypnosis, and they would begin coming up with memories. Now, it's believed that a lot of times what a therapist or psychiatrist or doctor would do at the time would be to project what those memories were. Saying, suggest things to a person in a suggestive state, therefore making it look like a memory was emerging when in fact one was actually being created. Also, some of these people could actually have not been under, and they could have just been making it up. If I had a dime for every evangelist that says that he was an ex-satanic high priest, and he's not anyone I met, and the stuff that he talks about isn't anything that I remember. That, and then they have a lot of errors when they talk about the occult, and they can't be very specific. I remember one evangelist talked about a ritual, I believe, I think it was Jack Van Impe. Anyway, I'm not sure. But he talked about a ritual where incense burned from a crucible. Now, if you know what a crucible is, it's something used in metalworking. It's not something you burn incense in. Anybody in the occult would say that. As a matter of fact, they oftentimes use the word censer or incense burner, but they don't use the word crucible. This is actually very egregious in the sense that it's an obvious error. Obviously, he was never an occultist. You don't get to be a high priest and make a mistake like that when you're talking to people. I guess there might be some circle of people somewhere in the world that would refer as an incense burner as a crucible, but not a high priest. It's just not something they would say. I'd love to actually sit down and talk to them and ask for specific details on any of the occult systems that are currently practiced by the left-hand path, be that a knock-in, Kabbalah, or anything, any part of it, Thelema, whatnot. I guarantee you none of them could give me any specific details on anything important past what someone could learn from a Google search. So, that being said, yeah, there's a lot of bluffers out there, and with my experience with these people who actually have the trust of the community bluffing, it's not a big stretch to think that individuals could be bluffing. And whether they were in cahoots with a psychiatrist or therapist that was hypnotizing them, who knows? But the point is that it happened. And if there were a national or even global cabal of people that would abduct children from daycare centers and whatnot, and then perform rituals on them as odd as like dressing up like a policeman and a monster or whatever, I mean, I think eventually somebody would have gotten caught, some evidence would have occurred, especially if they were talking about like killing people and things like that. You just can't do that on a national level and some evidence doesn't surface sooner or later. The explanation they would use is, well, the Satanists were in cahoots with the cops. I do know one cop that's a Satanist. That's the only one. I know one cop that was a left-hand pather, and that's it. Now, I guess you could say I'm lying about this, but if I were, honestly, I wouldn't even be making this video if I had that kind of pull. And I don't think any left-hand pather controls either the media or the police department. And if they did, there would be other things they would be doing, much more productive uses of that kind of power other than just murdering people and giving children weird experiences. And the thought was, and again, it's obvious when they start projecting intention. The Satanic Panic people, especially the recovered memory people, would say that they are trying to make a satanic army and turn these people into assassins or robots or Manchurian candidates, basically. It's fanciful, but how did they even know that was the reason for their abuse? It seems like at one point they're projecting. I don't know. But anyway, also you have to remember the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of people experimenting with drugs. I don't even think I need to go further with that. Yeah, a lot of people had completely damaged their minds, and it's not that I'm against the use of psychedelics, but I think their improper use can hurt you if you're not careful. Just like fire can burn down your house or cook your food, there's a big difference between the two. So anyway, you have this recovered memory clowns that were coming up, and just the stuff got more and more absurd as things went on. I wish people weren't losing their jobs and we could have just let them continue and let things just get crazy when they started talking about like UFOs visiting them and so forth. It would have just gotten laughable, kind of like the conspiracy theory community is today. What's worrying me now is that some of these conspiracy theory groups are actually getting a little more traction than normal, talking about Luciferians controlling the government and so forth. And it's starting to smell a little bit more like the Satanic Panic than it had in previous months. I've noticed a lot of high-profile Satanists and left-hand pathers, and it seems like I hear more and more cases of them being accused of things, and I don't know for sure. There's no way of knowing. But this is kind of how it started. It was a trickle at first, and it turned into a deluge very quickly. There isn't so much a renaissance in the occult now. We're getting a little more people because the information is easier to get. Back in the old days, you could spend up to $3,000 on books and still not be very well informed. Nowadays, most of the better books and grimoires in the occult are available by a Google search. And the PDFs are available. So the information is out there, and it's basically free to anyone with a phone or a computer or a tablet. And an internet connection, of course. So this has given us some unity also because we're able to communicate with one another across national lines. You know, back in the 80s, if you wanted to talk to somebody in another state, you had to make a long-distance phone call at the best, or mail them a letter. You can see how this impeded communication. Talking to someone in, say, from Texas, talking to someone in Oklahoma for an hour could cost you $50 to $100. It was very expensive to keep up connections with people in other states. Now that's actually not a problem. On the internet, I can talk to people, even by video chat, almost every night at no expense to me. So this has given us some unity, and we have a little bit more of this going on, and there's more communication because we no longer have to invest huge amounts of money for books. So the occult is going through a kind of a tiny renaissance, but nothing like it was going through in the 80s. Atheism is on the rise, which I'm just pleased as punch about. But, you know, that is actually turning Christianity into a wounded animal. They're hurt from Islam. They're threatened from that angle. They're threatened from atheism. And its old enemy, the occult, the left-hand path, just rears its ugly head. And the first thing they're going to want to do is lop it off. Christians have always had weird fantasies about Satanism, and some could even say that the religion of Satanism was created by Christianity's paranoid fears of paganism. And, you know, if you're not familiar with the book Malleus Maleficarium, especially if you're into Satanism and the left-hand path, you need to read this book. It is not a grimoire. It is propaganda from, I think it was written sometime in the 1600s, but I could be wrong about the dates. But yeah, Malleus Maleficarium, it's a very weird book, and it's got some odd impressions about what witches do. And when they say witches, they're not talking about like Wiccans or pagan witches. They're talking about Satanists, because in the book they actually encounter Satan at one of the groups. They call them Sabbats, but that's actually a funny word too, because it's actually a term for what Jews do, and even witches use it now, not even knowing that it actually comes from this book of propaganda about Satanists. So it's just funny how the four religions are interacting. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and not Islam, Satanism and Wicca. Yeah, it's just crazy. Also, for instance, the entity Baphomet. A lot of Satanists like to talk about Baphomet. It's rumored that his name was created by a fantasy that Philip the Fair had about rumors that he spread about the Knights Templar, basically. And it could have been a word for Muhammad, a mispronunciation of Muhammad, basically. Became Baphomet. And this might have been the fact that some of the Knights Templar might have converted secretly to Islam there's no way of knowing because they killed off De Molay and all of the Knights Templar. It was a very odd situation. But after that, and before the Christians had wiped out the Cathars and Gnostics, it's like each time there's a heresy, they have to wipe it out. But Satanism was the perfect heresy because it didn't even exist at the time. And you had a few weird oddballs like Gilderrath and so forth. And what can I say? Oftentimes on Left Hand Path and satanic sites, there's a big argument about when Satanism actually began. One gentleman I know insisted it started with Anton LaVey. I do know there were French poets both before and after the French Revolution, and the name escapes me, but I did have it written down, and I'll bring it up if anybody asks me in the comments, that identified as a Satanist. Bottom line, and really the only thing you need for Satanism to exist is somebody say, I am a Satanist, therefore Satanism exists. Hands down. But anyway, they'd been romancing this fantasy that there was this odd group that somehow, and the Illuminati, the Protocols, the Elders of Zion, was possibly, most people think it was a forgery written to basically get rid of the Jews, give an excuse to get rid of the Jews. And even Hitler used the Illuminati, the global Zionist conspiracy, as an excuse for the Holocaust. Whether that's true or not, who knows? I mean, I don't really believe there's an international Jewish conspiracy, but, conspiracies happen. Who knows? But the point is that recently they've kind of tied together Luciferianism, Satanism, the left-hand path, and the Illuminati, which is funny. Now, there are some pseudo-left-hand path, and the OTO isn't really a left-hand path group, but it's associated with the Crowley, and you can't really get into the left-hand path without talking about Crowley. They actually will refer to themselves as the Illuminati, although I know they're not. Not in the sense the conspiracy theorists talk about. They don't control the media, they don't control the government, they don't control the police. They're just nice people. And, that's about, people ask me, well, what do you know about the OTO? And I'll tell you, well, they'll feed you real well, honestly. Some of the best meals I ever had were hanging out with OTO people. I don't know. But that's just the way it is. But anyway, getting back to the what's going on currently. This phantom of this conspiracy is actually occurring, and I don't even know if it's bad to deny. It might be good press for the left-hand path, in that we're such a tiny fraction of the population, yet somehow, with all the terrorism, with all the bombings and persecution and wars and everything else going on, somehow this tiny fraction of the population, which doesn't really control that much wealth, power, or influence, is perceived as being behind the whole thing. It's odd. Really is. I'm reminded of how in the Passion plays, back in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, the Jews would be shown with horns on their heads. And they talked about Jews stealing babies in the middle of the night. Now, obviously, they couldn't have been doing that. And they don't do that now, I'm sure, but it's funny how these fantasies come up in people's heads when times are changing. And the 1600s was, shortly after the Protestant Reformation, or kind of almost during it. You had the 30-Year War, you had the printing press, the world was changing rapidly. And the powers that be were panicking. And when people panic, problems occur. And I guess that's where I'm getting to. I see a lot of change going on now. The internet is kind of growing up. And yes, groups like ours are able to talk to one another, but also the conspiracy theory community is talking to one another. Most of that is harmless. Some of these people are my friends, honestly. They're not bad people. But allegations of a group being a threat can get out of hand. I could think of several examples historically, but I think we all know where I'm going with this. When you ascribe one tiny fraction of the population, every problem that comes down the pipe becomes eligible to be thrown on them. And once you throw one problem on a group and it sticks, it's just natural to keep throwing it until either that group is gone or whatever. And most of the time this is done as a distraction technique, not even intentionally. It's just, there's a problem, we don't know what's going on, let's blame these people we don't like. What can I say? I think anything more at this point would just be pretty much beating a dead horse. But anyway, you get the idea. That was a satanic panic. And I guess what I'm saying is that if you meet someone who starts telling you about this Luciferian heresy, and don't give them too much shit, but at the same time, let them know that, okay, ask them some rational questions. Where is any tangible evidence that this is going on? Just one piece of factual evidence. Doesn't even have to be that good. A body. An actual occurrence. Someone coming out and saying something that is verifiable. Any of these people saying they were an ex-Satanist, ask for details. Not just details on what they did that was criminal, but specifically, how did they practice? What did they believe? What exactly were they doing, and how was their group structured? That's basically it. We're a religion, basically. Not just Satanism, but the left-hand path in general. We're a religion, and some people don't like religion. That's fine. Some people do. The point is, no matter what you think the problems are and who's causing it, we're not numerous enough to do even a tiny percentage of the things that are heaped upon us. I urge you guys to keep that in mind if you're one of the people who is worried about us. We're just not that big. And a couple of Google searches can actually prove this. And then, yes, you think, oh, that could be faked. But could that be faked on a national and even global scale? Could we hide something if it was nearly as insidious and widespread as what you say? I don't know. But anyway, that's it for today. I will be making more videos soon as I've kind of gotten the hang of this thing. And think for yourself, guys, and that's it.